They were told Americans would strip them naked and let soldiers watch. But when 30 German women auxiliaries arrived at Camp Shanks, New York, in August 1945, the enemy broke them not with humiliation, but with compassion. They expected leering guards and icy water. Instead, American nurses stepped into the showers alongside them, soap in hand, steam rising around their bare shoulders. The women who had operated Hitler's radios and typed his orders prepared for degradation. What they received was a lesson in dignity that would haunt them long after the war's wounds had healed. Like and subscribe for more incredible true stories from World War II that history books never taught you. The buses rolled through Camp Shanks's gates under a gray August sky, wheels splashing through puddles left by morning rain. Women in tattered Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms, the Helferinnen, peered through foggy windows at wooden barracks stretching in neat rows against the Hudson River landscape. Their journey had been long, from bombed-out Berlin to temporary holding camps, across the Atlantic on military transports where seasickness claimed many, and finally to this place they'd been told was a processing station before their real punishment would begin. Helga Kramer, 23, a former radio operator for the Luftwaffe, noticed the American flag hanging limp in the humid air. Just months ago, she had encoded messages ordering bombers to destroy American positions. Now she was in America itself, her uniform stained with sweat, her blonde hair dulled by weeks without proper washing, her blue eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. The buses stopped beside a low building marked Processing Center. Female MPs in crisp uniforms opened the doors. "Raus! Quickly now!" they called in accented German. The prisoners shuffled down the steps, clutching small bundles of possessions, photographs of family, extra socks, a hairbrush, whatever they'd managed to keep through captivity so far. The first thing that hit them was the smell, antiseptic cleaning fluid mixed with fresh paint and coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Nothing like the sour stench of fear and filth they'd lived with during the chaotic final months of the Reich. Inside the processing center, bright electric lights hummed overhead, making many squint after the dimness of the bus. English words echoed against tile floors as American personnel called instructions to one another. Most startling was the normalcy of it all. The ordered lines, the clean desks, the clacking typewriters. This was not the chaos of retribution they had been warned to expect. American women in white nurse uniforms moved among them, checking for obvious illness. Their faces neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional. The air felt different too, heavy with humidity, but somehow freer than the air of defeated Germany. Birds called from nearby trees, and somewhere a radio played a jazz tune that seemed jarringly peaceful after years of martial music and air raid sirens. "They're fattening us up before the real punishment," whispered Ilse Weber, a former secretary from the propaganda ministry. Her thin face was tight with suspicion as she watched an American nurse measure a dose of medicine for a prisoner with a cough. Helga didn't answer. She was watching a black American woman give orders to white soldiers, something impossible in the Reich she'd served. Her worldview trembled slightly at the sight. "My cousin was in Dachau when the Americans liberated it," murmured Greta Hoffman, barely 20 and still wearing her Hitler Youth pin. "She said they made the guards bury the dead with their bare hands. What will they make us do?" Around them, the 30 women clustered together like frightened birds, their bodies tense with anticipation of horrors to come. Some prayed silently, others stood with resignation etched in the lines around their mouths. They had been the backbone of the Nazi war machine, the women who sent the messages, kept the records, operated the searchlights during Allied bombing raids. Now they waited for American vengeance. What they couldn't understand was the absence of hatred in the eyes that assessed them. The American nurses moved among them with brisk efficiency, but no cruelty. This contradicted everything Reich propaganda had told them would happen if Germany lost the war. The contradiction gnawed at them as they shuffled forward in line for processing. Each woman listening for the sounds of torture they'd been warned would come, each wondering when the facade of civility would drop away. All personal items on the table, jewelry, photographs, papers, everything, the American sergeant said in careful German. She was older than most of the prisoners, perhaps 40, with practical hands and a face that looked like it rarely smiled. Helga placed her few treasures on the wooden table, a photograph of her parents outside their bakery in Munich, a silver bracelet from her grandmother, a small notebook where she'd recorded her thoughts during the final days of the Reich and her journey into captivity. "You'll get these back after decontamination," the sergeant said, placing each item in a paper envelope marked with Helga's prisoner number, G117. The word decontamination sent a ripple of fear through the women. Rumors had circulated during the Atlantic crossing that Americans might sterilize German women to prevent the Nazi breed from continuing. Several younger women clutched their abdomens instinctively. They were led down a corridor to a large room divided by canvas screens. On one side, tables held piles of clothing, plain dresses, underwear, sensible shoes, all American-made. On the other side, behind the screens, came the sound of running water. "Remove all clothing. Everything must be deloused," instructed a nurse, her face impassive but not cruel. "Typhus is still a risk. We can't have an outbreak." The women froze. In the Reich, modesty had been valued, morality emphasized. To strip naked before the enemy seemed the first step toward the degradation they'd been warned about. "The guards will watch us," whispered Ilsa, her voice breaking. "They told us this would happen." As if hearing her fears, an American nurse in her 30s stepped forward. Her name tag read, Lieutenant Martha Sullivan. She spoke in carefully pronounced German. "I understand your concern. There are no male personnel in this building, only female medical staff. This is a medical procedure, not punishment." Still, no one moved. The 30 women stood rigid, eyes downcast, arms wrapped around themselves as if already naked and cold. Lieutenant Sullivan glanced at her watch, then at her fellow nurses. She made a decision. "Margaret, Ellen, Ruth, come with me," she said to 3 other nurses. Then, to the German women's astonishment, she began unbuttoning her own uniform. "What are you doing?" asked the sergeant sharply. "Showing them there's nothing to fear," Sullivan replied, continuing to undress. The 3 nurses she'd called followed suit, their movements matter of fact. Helga and the others watched in disbelief as the American women stripped down to their underwear, then removed that too. Standing naked, the lieutenant addressed them again. "We will shower with you. The water is warm. The soap is just soap, not chemicals. We are nurses, not executioners." The shock of seeing enemy personnel voluntarily undressing alongside them broke through the German women's fear. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to remove their filthy uniforms. Helga unbuttoned her Luftwaffe tunic, fingers trembling not with cold, but with the strange reversal of power. The enemy was making herself vulnerable to prove safety, not forcing vulnerability as punishment. When they were all undressed, the American nurses led the way to the shower room. True to Sullivan's word, the water that sprayed from the pipes was warm, not icy. The soap, when handed out in small white bars, smelled of nothing more sinister than lavender. Helga watched the American nurse beside her, Ruth, according to her discarded name tag, wash matter-of-factly, showing through example how to use the delousing shampoo. The woman's body was strong and well-fed compared to the German prisoners, whose ribs showed through skin turned sallow by years of poor rations. "My mother was born in Hamburg," Ruth said quietly in accented German as she noticed Helga's stare. "She came to America in 1920. I still have cousins in Germany, if they survived the bombing." It was the first personal connection offered, the first acknowledgement that the enemy was not a faceless monster, but a person with her own history. Helga found herself suddenly fighting tears as warm water streamed over her face, washing away grime from the journey and something deeper, perhaps the beginnings of the hatred she'd been taught to nurture. Across the shower room, other small interactions took place. Lieutenant Sullivan helped an older German woman wash her hair, the gray strands darkening underwater. Another nurse showed a girl with an injured arm how to manage the soap without straining her wound. When it was over, they were given clean towels, real cotton, thick and white, and led to where the new clothing waited. Plain cotton dresses, underwear that wasn't darned or patched, shoes with intact soles. Simple but decent. Not prison uniforms, not the rags they'd expected. "These are for us?" asked Greta, touching a blue dress as if it might dissolve under her fingers. Standard issue for female detainees, replied the sergeant. Choose your size. When they were dressed, their old uniforms were taken away for burning. With them went the visible symbols of the regime they'd served, the eagle badges, the insignia of rank. Yet somehow, this removal of identity didn't feel like the humiliation they'd steeled themselves against. Instead, standing in clean clothes, skin still warm from hot water, many felt a strange sense of being human again, not just defeated enemies. Helga caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall. Her face looked younger without the grime of travel, her hair darker when clean. The blue dress hung loosely on her malnourished frame, but it was whole, without tears or patches. She hardly recognized herself. In her small notebook, retrieved along with her other possessions, she would later write, "They had the power to humiliate us. Instead, they showed us respect. Which is worse? To be stripped by force would confirm everything we were told about the enemy. To be treated with dignity challenges everything. I am not certain which would be easier to bear." The mess hall doors opened to a scene from another world. Long tables covered with white cloths. Real plates, not the tin containers they'd eaten from on the transport. The smell of meat, potatoes, vegetables, not the thin soup and stale bread of defeat. "This cannot be for us," Ilsa said, stopping at the doorway. "It must be for the American officers." But they were guided to seats and served by kitchen staff wearing white aprons over uniforms. On each plate, roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, a dinner roll with real butter. Beside each plate, a glass of milk and a mug of coffee. The women sat stiffly, not touching the food. In their experience, abundance like this came at a price. They waited for the announcement of what would be demanded in return. "Eat," encouraged a young American woman supervising the meal. "It's getting cold." Still, they hesitated. Reich propaganda had warned them that Americans might poison German prisoners or conduct medical experiments on them. The food looked too good, too plentiful to be without sinister purpose. Lieutenant Sullivan, now back in her nurse's uniform, seemed to understand. She walked to Helga's table, took a clean fork, and sampled food from one woman's plate, then another's and another's. She chewed, swallowed, and smiled slightly. "It's just food," she said. "Not as good as my mother's cooking, but decent." That small act of tasting their food, showing it wasn't poisoned, broke through another barrier. Cautiously, the women began to eat. For many, it was the first proper meal in months. Helga cut a small piece of beef, raised it to her mouth, and nearly gasped at the flavor. Real meat, not the mystery protein of wartime rations. Beside her, Greta made a small sound of pleasure as she tasted the mashed potatoes. Across the table, an older woman named Margareta Schneider began to weep silently, tears falling into her coffee cup. She had been a cook in an officer's mess in Berlin before being drafted into service as a searchlight operator. For 3 years, she had created meals from dwindling supplies, watching portions grow smaller as the Reich collapsed. Now, in enemy hands, she was served food that Germany couldn't provide even for its fighting men in the final months. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Lieutenant Sullivan, who stood nearby. "Why feed us like this? We are the enemy." Sullivan considered before answering. "The Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of prisoners of war. But more than that," she paused, searching for words in her limited German, "we are not at war with hunger or illness. Those are everyone's enemies." It was an answer none of them had expected, an answer that contradicted years of propaganda about American savagery. As they ate, slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, another certainty began to crumble. After the meal, they were led to their barracks. Unlike the crowded transport ships or the temporary camps in Europe, these buildings were clean, with swept wooden floors and windows that opened to let in fresh air. Each woman was assigned a bunk with a real mattress, thin but new, sheets, a pillow, and a wool blanket. "Toilets and washing facilities are there," said their guide, pointing to doors at the end of the building. "Lights out at 10 p.m., roll call at 6 a.m. They were given small personal items, a toothbrush and paste, a comb, soap for washing clothes, a towel. basic necessities that had become luxuries in the final days of the Reich. "We can keep these?" asked Ilsa, holding the toothbrush as if it were made of gold. "Those are yours," confirmed the guide. That night, as they prepared for sleep, the reality of their situation began to settle in. They were prisoners, yes, but not in the conditions they had been warned to expect. The barracks were not freezing. No one had been beaten or molested. They had been fed, bathed, clothed. "It's a trick," insisted Ilsa, sitting on her bunk, still suspicious. "Tomorrow will be different. They're just fattening us up before the real work begins." But Helga wasn't so sure anymore. She thought of Lieutenant Sullivan in the shower, making herself as vulnerable as her prisoners to prove there was nothing to fear. She thought of the nurse named Ruth, whose mother had come from Hamburg. Small cracks appeared in the wall of hatred she'd been taught to maintain. In other bunks, women whispered prayers or cried quietly. Some wrote letters they hoped might someday reach family in Germany. A few simply stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend this strange new reality where the enemy provided better care than their own collapsing government had in its final days. Lights out came, and darkness filled the barracks, broken only by moonlight through the windows. In that darkness, Helga pulled out her notebook and wrote by faint light, "First day of captivity. We have been treated with unexpected decency. The Americans seem determined to show us they are not the monsters we were told they were. The most frightening thing is that I am beginning to wonder what other lies we were told." She closed the book and tucked it under her pillow. Outside, crickets sang in the warm New York night. Inside, 30 women lay in clean beds, with full stomachs, washed hair, and a growing uncertainty about everything they had believed. "Aufstehen! Wake up!" The voice belonged to a female MP, firm but not harsh. Helga blinked awake in the gray dawn light filtering through the barracks windows. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in Berlin, before the bombs, before the surrender. Then reality returned. The American camp, the clean sheets, the strange new status as prisoner of war. The first week established a rhythm unlike anything they had expected. Roll call at 6 a.m., followed by breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with real butter and jam, coffee or tea. Then work assignments. The work surprised them most. They had expected hard labor, perhaps dangerous or degrading tasks. Instead, they were assigned to the camp laundry, the kitchen, the vegetable garden, or light administrative duties. They were paid a small allowance in camp scrip, not much, but enough to purchase items at the camp canteen. Helga was assigned to the camp hospital as a clerical assistant, perhaps because her English was better than most. Each morning, she reported to Lieutenant Sullivan, who gave her simple tasks: filing papers, transcribing medical notes, organizing supply cabinets. "You have neat handwriting," Sullivan commented on the third day, reviewing Helga's transcription of patient records. "I was a radio operator," Helga replied cautiously. "We had to keep precise logs." She waited for judgment, for some reference to the fact that her work had supported bombing raids on American forces. But Sullivan merely nodded. "That explains your attention to detail. Can you help organize the medication cabinet today? Everything needs to be alphabetical." Other women had similar experiences. Margaret, the former cook, was assigned to the camp kitchen, where her skills were recognized and appreciated. Greta, young and strong, worked in the camp garden, growing vegetables that supplemented their meals. Ilsa, with her secretarial background, was placed in the camp administration office. Each day followed a predictable pattern: work in the morning, a lunch break, more work in the afternoon, then free time before dinner. After dinner, they could read books from a small library, write letters, or simply talk among themselves until lights out. The predictability itself became a kind of comfort. There were no sudden punishments, no arbitrary cruelties. Rules existed and were explained clearly. Infractions resulted in loss of canteen privileges or extra work assignments, not physical abuse. "It's a well-designed deception," Ilsa maintained during the first weeks, still convinced that harsher treatment awaited them. "They're studying us, learning our weaknesses." But as days turned into weeks, even her suspicion began to waver in the face of consistent, decent treatment. The camp canteen became a window into an almost unimaginable world. Here, with their meager earnings, they could purchase small luxuries: chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, even cosmetics. After years of increasing deprivation in Germany, the abundance seemed almost obscene. Helga stood before the display of toiletries one afternoon, staring at items that had disappeared from Berlin shops years ago: face cream, shampoo, talcum powder. "What are you saving for?" asked Ruth, the nurse whose mother had come from Hamburg. She often stopped to chat with Helga when their shifts coincided. "I don't know," Helga admitted. "It seems wrong to buy face cream when people at home are starving." Ruth's expression softened. "The first package you're allowed to send home, you can include such things. They'll mean more than you know." The possibility of sending help home hadn't occurred to Helga. It shifted her perspective slightly. Perhaps purchasing these items wasn't self-indulgence, but preparation for helping family. The contrast extended beyond material goods. Letters began arriving from Germany, heavily censored but still conveying the desperate conditions there. Cities in ruins, food scarce, the occupation bringing its own challenges. Greta received news that her family's apartment in Dresden had been completely destroyed in the February bombing. They were living in a cellar with 3 other families, subsisting on rations that barely sustained life. Margaret learned that her husband, missing since the Eastern Front collapsed, had been confirmed dead in a Soviet prison camp. The brief official notice was marked with water stains that might have been tears. Ilsa's sister wrote from Munich, "If you have any extra food, any at all, send it. The children haven't had milk in months." These letters were read aloud in the barracks at night, shared griefs binding the women more closely than shared ideology ever had. They wept together over lost homes, dead husbands and brothers, starving children. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. Here, in enemy custody, they ate 3 meals a day. They slept in clean beds. They had access to medical care. Meanwhile, in the homeland they had served, their loved ones suffered deprivations far worse than what they experienced as prisoners. "The Führer promised us the world," Margaret said bitterly one evening, after receiving another letter describing conditions in Berlin. "Instead, he left us ruins and graves." It was the first time anyone had openly criticized Hitler in the barracks. No one contradicted her. The physical changes in the women became another stark contrast. After weeks of regular meals, their bodies began to recover from years of poor nutrition. Hollow cheeks filled out. Dull hair regained luster. Even their skin improved with proper washing and adequate vitamins. Lieutenant Sullivan noted the changes during Helga's weekly medical checkup. "You've gained 5 pounds, she said, marking it in Helga's chart. "That's good. You were underweight." "Everyone at home is underweight," Helga replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Sullivan met her eyes. "Yes, I know. Our medical units in Germany report severe malnutrition, especially among children. It will take time to rebuild." "Why did you bomb everything if you were just going to rebuild it?" The question burst from Helga before she could stop it. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "That's a complicated question, but the rebuilding is happening. The Marshall Plan—" She paused, seeing Helga's confusion. "It's an American program to help reconstruct Europe, including Germany." This was new information. Reich propaganda had portrayed Americans as interested only in destroying German civilization, not rebuilding it. Another contradiction to process. Small, unexpected interactions began to pierce the barrier between captors and prisoners. A young MP named Sarah Rogers taught several of the women American card games during evening recreation hours. Greta showed the kitchen staff how to make proper German potato dumplings with limited ingredients, earning genuine appreciation. Helga, working in the hospital, had more contact with Americans than most. One rainy afternoon, she was filing papers when Lieutenant Sullivan approached with a cup of coffee. "You've been working for hours," she said, setting the cup on Helga's desk. "Take a break." The small kindness, unnecessary, unexpected, caught Helga off guard. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Sullivan lingered. "May I ask you something?" "You don't have to answer." Helga nodded cautiously. "Were you a party member? A true believer?" The question hung between them, dangerous and personal. Helga considered lying, then decided truth was simpler. Yes, since I was 16. We all were. She braced for judgment. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. I wondered. You seem to be struggling more than some with being here. The ones who joined for opportunity rather than conviction are adapting. Faster. The observation was surprisingly astute. Helga had indeed been a committed believer, not merely an opportunistic member. The contradictions she now faced cut deeper because of it. How did you know? She asked. Sullivan smiled slightly. I studied psychology before becoming a nurse. People fascinate me. She gestured to the coffee. Drink before it gets cold. She walked away, leaving Helga with the realization that this enemy nurse had seen through her more clearly than many of her German comrades ever had. Other small moments accumulated. An MP slipping extra chocolate to the women who worked hardest in the garden. A doctor teaching Margaret English cooking terms so she could better understand kitchen instructions. A chaplain offering non-denominational services that some women hesitantly attended. One significant moment came when Ruth, the nurse with German heritage, brought photographs of her family to show Helga. This is my mother, she said, pointing to a woman with a distinctly German face. And these are my cousins in Hamburg, from before the war. The black and white images showed smiling people in front of a small house, with a garden. Normal people, not so different from Helga's own family. Do you know if they survived? Helga asked. Ruth's face tightened. No, we lost contact in 1942. I'm trying to trace them through the Red Cross. For the first time, Helga saw the war from the other side. Families separated. Uncertainty about loved ones. Grief that crossed enemy lines. The realization that suffering wasn't unique to Germans, that Americans too had lost and worried and grieved, was another crack in the wall of her indoctrination. Not all interactions were positive. Some guards remained coldly professional. A few office workers made cutting remarks about Hitler's secretaries when the German women could hear. Certain nurses avoided working with them entirely. And among the prisoners themselves, divisions emerged. Those like Ilse, who gradually accepted the reality of decent treatment, began to separate from those who clung rigidly to Reich ideology and insisted it was all an American trick. Helga found herself increasingly in the former group, though the transition brought its own pain. Each realization that she had been misled was like losing a piece of herself. Yet truth, however uncomfortable, became preferable to comfortable lies. In her notebook, she wrote, "Today, Ruth showed me photos of her German family. I found myself hoping they survived the bombing, even though months ago I would have said all American connections to Germany were traitors. What is happening to me? Am I becoming a traitor too? Or am I finally seeing clearly?" These human connections, small but significant, did what no propaganda could achieve. They transformed abstract enemies into complex individuals. The process was painful, disorienting, and entirely unexpected. They had prepared themselves for cruelty, which would have confirmed everything they'd been taught about Americans. Kindness and respect undermined those teachings more effectively than any punishment could have. By the third month of captivity, a profound internal struggle gripped many of the women. Their daily experiences directly contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. This cognitive dissonance created a painful choice. Either cling to their previous worldview and reject the evidence before them, or accept that they had been systematically misled and abandon beliefs central to their identity. Helga's crisis came during a thunderstorm in October. The crash of thunder triggered memories of air raids, sending her into a momentary panic during her shift at the hospital. When Lieutenant Sullivan found her trembling behind a supply cabinet, the nurse didn't mock or scold. Instead, she sat quietly beside Helga until the episode passed. "I used to hide in a cellar in Berlin," Helga explained, embarrassed by her weakness. "The bombs sounded like that." "I understand," Sullivan replied. "My brother had similar reactions after Normandy. Loud noises, fireworks, even car backfires would send him under furniture." The comparison startled Helga. "Your brother fought at Normandy? Against us?" Sullivan nodded. "He was a medic, treated German prisoners as well as American soldiers." "Is he?" Helga couldn't finish the question. "He survived. He's studying medicine now." Sullivan hesitated, then added, "He says the hardest thing wasn't the fighting. It was seeing how young everyone was on both sides. Kids killing kids is how he described it. The conversation haunted Helga for days. She had been taught that American soldiers were brutal gangsters, Jewish puppets, or Bolshevik sympathizers, not young men with nightmares like German soldiers, not brothers whose sisters worried about them. The humanity of the enemy had never been part of her education. Meanwhile, more news filtered in from Germany through letters and officially approved newspapers. The extent of Nazi atrocities was becoming public knowledge. Camps like Dachau and Auschwitz were no longer secret. The Nuremberg trials had begun, with testimony and evidence too detailed to be dismissed as mere propaganda. Many women reacted with genuine shock and disbelief. "It cannot be true," insisted Greta, the youngest among them, who had grown up entirely under Nazi education. Germans would not do such things. Then why do they have photographs, documents, testimonies? Countered Margaret, who had lost faith in the Reich when her husband died on the Eastern Front. Why did we never ask where the Jewish families in our neighborhoods were sent? These debates raged in hushed tones after Lights Out, painful soul-searching that left many in tears. Some, like Ilsa, retreated into silence, unable to reconcile what they were learning with what they had believed. Others, like Margaret, embraced the painful truth with a convert's zeal, denouncing everything about their former allegiance. Helga walked a middle path, methodically examining each new piece of information against her previous beliefs, slowly rebuilding her understanding of recent history. Her notebook became a record of this transformation. Pages filled with questions, contradictions noted, new facts incorporated. "If what they say about the camps is true," she wrote one night, "then what were we really fighting for? What cause did my brother die for at Stalingrad? Were we the heroes or the villains of this story? And if we were the villains, what does that make me?" The ideological struggle wasn't merely individual. It played out in the community of women as they tried to make sense of their new reality together. Factions formed, not based on previous rank or position, but on how each woman responded to the challenges to their worldview. The true believers, dwindling in number but fierce in conviction, maintained that American kindness was a trap, and reports of Nazi atrocities were fabricated. They kept to themselves, speaking German exclusively, observing Reich holidays in secret, and regarding those who adapted with suspicion. The pragmatists accepted current circumstances without necessarily abandoning their previous beliefs. They learned English, performed their work well, and took advantage of educational opportunities in the camp, all while suspending deeper questions about the regime they had served. The converters embraced American perspectives enthusiastically, sometimes too eagerly, as if trying to erase their previous selves. They spoke English even among themselves, adopted American habits, and distanced themselves from German identity. The seekers, among whom Helga counted herself, approached their situation as a painful but necessary education. They questioned, discussed, compared notes, and gradually constructed a new understanding of recent history and their place in it. These divisions created tension in the barracks, with accusations of betrayal on one side and willful blindness on the other. The American staff noted these dynamics but generally allowed the process to unfold without interference, recognizing that genuine change could not be forced. One evening, a heated debate erupted during the quiet hour before Lights Out. The trigger was a Life magazine article about concentration camps that had somehow made its way into the barracks. The photographs, though months old, were new to many of the women. "Lies," declared one of the true believers, a former Luftwaffe communications officer named Elsa Brandt. "American propaganda." "I saw a camp near my hometown," countered another woman quietly. "Not the buildings inside, but the trains arriving. No one ever left. The smoke from the chimneys." She couldn't continue. "Traitor," Elsa hissed. "How can you believe their lies over your own people?" "Because our own people lied to us," Margaret interjected, her voice rising. "My cousin worked for the SS. He told my husband things, drunk one night on leave, things that kept my husband awake for days afterward." The argument escalated until an MP intervened, confiscating the magazine and ordering Lights Out early. But the divisions had hardened, the battle lines drawn more clearly than before. Later that night, Helga heard muffled sobs from several bunks. The pain of reconstruction was proving as difficult as the shock of defeat had been. By December, a deeper transformation had begun for many of the women. Beyond questioning specific Nazi policies or accepting Allied accounts of the war, they were confronting fundamental values and assumptions that had shaped their worldview. For Helga, this deeper recognition came gradually through her work in the hospital. Unlike factory labor or field work, medical care revealed values in action. She watched as American doctors treated everyone with the same attention. Prisoners, guards, officers, German women, everyone. "Why do you waste medicine on prisoners?" she finally asked Lieutenant Sullivan one day, after watching a doctor spend hours treating a German woman's infected tooth. "We would not do the same." Sullivan considered the question seriously. Because medical care isn't a reward for being on the right side. It's a human right. A human right, Helga repeated, testing the concept. "We were taught there are no universal human rights, only the rights of particular peoples based on their value to the race." "And how is that value determined?" Sullivan asked gently. Helga had no answer that didn't now sound hollow, even to herself. This recognition, that American power wasn't merely material but ideological, that the principles underlying their actions differed fundamentally from Nazi doctrine, sparked the most profound changes. Women who had accepted the hierarchical worldview of National Socialism found themselves confronted with a system that, whatever its flaws, at least aspired to universal rather than tribal values. Education played a crucial role in this transformation. Classes offered in the camp, English language, American history, basic democracy, weren't merely practical but philosophical. Concepts like individual rights, separation of powers, and due process stood in stark contrast to the Führerprinzip that had governed the Reich. Some women attended these classes purely for practical benefits, better jobs, possible early release, extra privileges. But even those found themselves absorbing new frameworks for understanding society and government. In school, we learned that democracy was chaos, that only strong leadership could unite a people, Greta remarked during an English class discussion. But here, everyone seems to argue all the time about politics, yet things still function. "That's the point," replied the American teacher. "The argument is the system, not a failure of the system." These concepts seeped in slowly, challenging not just political allegiances but foundational beliefs about how society should function and how individuals related to the state. Even more powerful were film nights, where newsreels and documentaries showed both the devastation of Europe and early reconstruction efforts. For many women, seeing their homeland in ruins brought home the consequences of the regime they had served more viscerally than any lecture could. After one such film, showing Berlin's destroyed neighborhoods, Margaret stood up abruptly and walked out. Helga followed, finding her behind the barracks, weeping. "My whole street, gone," Margaret said between sobs. "The bakery where I bought bread every morning, the school, everything." "I know," Helga said, putting an arm around the older woman's shoulders. "For what?" Margaret asked, her voice raw. "What was it all for? Look what he led us to. Look what we became part of." It was the question they were all confronting in different ways. What had their sacrifice and service actually achieved? What had they given their loyalty to? As the evidence mounted of both Nazi atrocities and the physical destruction of Germany itself, the answers became increasingly painful. In December, Helga wrote in her notebook, "The deepest cut is not learning that we lost, but questioning whether we deserved to win. Not just because of what some Germans did in those camps, but because of what all of us allowed to happen to our own humanity. We surrendered something essential long before the military surrender. I am only beginning to understand what it might be." The turning point came unexpectedly, during Christmas preparations at the camp. The American staff had decided to allow a small celebration, with modest decorations and special meals. They also permitted the women to organize a traditional German Christmas Eve observance in the barracks. Preparations brought a rare moment of unity among the prisoners. Even the most committed Nazi sympathizers participated in making decorations from available materials: paper stars, woven straw ornaments, small carved figures. Helga, helping prepare lists for the kitchen's holiday planning, was surprised when Lieutenant Sullivan approached her with an unusual request. "We'd like to include some traditional German Christmas foods in the meal," Sullivan explained. "Would you and Margaret consult with the kitchen staff? Within reason, of course. Some ingredients aren't available." The gesture, acknowledging their culture, respecting their traditions, struck Helga powerfully. It wasn't required by any convention. It served no strategic purpose. It was simply an act of human recognition. As Christmas Eve approached, another surprise arrived. Permission for the women to sing traditional German carols during their evening gathering. The true test came when they assembled in the barracks. Decorations hung, candles, carefully monitored, providing soft light. As they began, Stille Nacht, the door opened. Lieutenant Sullivan entered, accompanied by Ruth and several other nurses and MPs who had regular contact with the prisoners. They stood quietly at the back, listening. When the song ended, Sullivan spoke briefly. "We wanted to wish you all a peaceful Christmas," she said. "We know how difficult it is to be away from home, especially at this time." The simple acknowledgement of their humanity, not as defeated enemies but as people far from home at Christmas, broke something in Helga. She looked around the room at her fellow prisoners, at the Americans who had treated them with unexpected dignity, at the small decorations they had created together, and suddenly saw the scene with new clarity. The true division was not between German and American, not between victor and vanquished, but between those who recognized common humanity and those who denied it. The Reich had taught them to see others as less than human. Here, ironically, in captivity, they were learning to see everyone, including themselves, as fully human again. In that moment, standing in a prisoner of war barracks with Christmas decorations made from scraps, listening to the familiar melodies of home, but in a new context, Helga experienced a profound revelation. The enemy had not broken them with cruelty, which would have confirmed everything they believed. The enemy had broken them with kindness, which undermined the very foundation of what they had been taught. And in that breaking, there was also healing, a chance to rebuild something truer than what had been destroyed. As 1946 began, rumors spread through the camp. Repatriation was coming. The war had been over for months. Germany was divided into occupation zones. The process of sending prisoners home had begun. The news, which should have brought joy, instead triggered anxiety among many of the women. They had adjusted to camp life. They had food, shelter, medicine, safety. What awaited them in a destroyed Germany under foreign occupation? "My family's home is in the Russian zone," Ilse said during one barracks discussion, her face tense with worry. "The Americans here treat us well, but what will the Russians do to women who served the Reich?" Others had similar concerns. Those from cities like Dresden or Hamburg wondered if anything remained of their neighborhoods. Those who had openly questioned Nazi ideology in the camp worried about the reception they would face from family members who might still cling to old beliefs. And beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper anxiety. Who were they now? They had arrived as devoted servants of the Reich. They would return as what? Women whose fundamental understanding of recent history and their place in it had been transformed. How would they fit into a homeland they now viewed through different eyes? Helga shared these worries. Her family's bakery in Munich had been damaged but not destroyed, according to letters. But her parents remained proud Germans, who spoke of the war as a noble effort, undermined by betrayal. How could she explain her changed perspective without seeming like a traitor? "What will you tell them?" she asked Ruth during one of their last conversations in the hospital filing room. "Your family, I mean." "About us," Ruth thought for a moment. "The truth. That you were women who served your country as you understood your duty. That you were treated according to the principles we claim to stand for. That many of you changed in ways that give me hope for the future. And if they ask if you made friends with the enemy," Ruth smiled slightly, "I'll say I made friends with people I was ordered to see as enemies, and found we had more in common than I expected." The answer offered some comfort, but the anxiety remained. They were returning to a Germany they had left physically, but also one they had left ideologically. The journey home promised to be more complex than the journey into captivity had been. In early February, the orders came. The first group of women, including Helga, would be transported back to Germany within 2 weeks. Their destination would be reception centers in their respective occupation zones, from which they would make their way to whatever remained of their homes. Preparation for departure was methodical. Medical examinations ensured they were fit to travel. Paperwork documented their time in American custody. Each woman was issued a small payment in German currency, civilian clothing suitable for winter travel, and a package of basic supplies: soap, food rations, vitamins. The night before departure, Helga sat on her bunk, organizing the few possessions she would take. Her notebook, now filled with entries documenting her transformation. Photographs of her family, the blue dress she had been issued on arrival, now worn but still serviceable. A small English dictionary given to her by Lieutenant Sullivan. Margaret, who would be in the second group to leave, sat beside her. What will you say when people ask about America? Helga considered carefully. The truth, that they treated us better than we would have treated them, that everything we were taught about them was wrong. Be careful who you tell that to, Margaret warned. Not everyone will want to hear it. Many still believe, or pretend to believe. It's easier than facing what we became part of. The warning was wise. Germany in defeat would be a complex landscape of denial, shame, pragmatic adaptation, and genuine remorse. Navigating it would require discretion about sharing the full extent of their changed perspectives. On the morning of departure, the women gathered one last time in the mess hall. A simple farewell had been arranged: coffee, pastries, brief speeches. Lieutenant Sullivan addressed them formally, but with genuine feeling. "You came here as prisoners," she said. "You return as witnesses. What you have seen of America, what you have learned here, take it with you. Tell the truth of your experience, whatever that truth is for each of you. The world needs honest witnesses now more than ever." As they boarded the buses that would take them to the ships waiting to cross the Atlantic, Helga felt a strange reluctance. She had arrived frightened and defiant. She was leaving reflective and uncertain, carrying within her a more complex understanding of both her former enemies and herself. Years later, in 1955, Helga Kramer sat in the rebuilt bakery in Munich, watching her young nephew play with a toy airplane. Germany was recovering, rebuilding, moving forward with an economic miracle that would have seemed impossible in the ruins of 1945. She had returned to find her parents alive, but changed. Her father missing a leg from a late war injury, her mother prematurely aged by years of anxiety and poor nutrition. Their bakery had reopened, smaller than before, but successful in the growing economy. Helga herself had trained as a nurse after her return, inspired partly by her experience in the camp hospital. Now she worked at a Munich clinic, using skills she had first observed in American medical practices. When people asked about her time as a prisoner of war, she told them selective truths: the decent conditions, adequate food, work assignments. She rarely shared the deeper transformation, the fundamental questioning of values and beliefs. That remained private, discussed only with others who had undergone similar journeys. But the impact of those months in American captivity shaped everything about her post-war life: her choice of profession, her political views, her careful attention to propaganda in the new German media, her quiet insistence on seeing people as individuals rather than categories. The shower room scene remained her most vivid memory. American nurses undressing alongside German prisoners to prove the water was safe, not poisoned. That moment of vulnerability and trust had cracked open a worldview built on fear and superiority. The soap had washed away more than physical dirt. It had begun the cleaning of a mind polluted by years of calculated hatred. In her nightstand drawer, she still kept her camp notebook, its pages a record of painful growth. Occasionally she reread it, tracing the path from certainty to doubt to a different, more nuanced kind of certainty. "What are you thinking about, Tante Helga?" her nephew asked, noticing her distant expression. Helga smiled. "I was thinking about soap," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand, and how sometimes the smallest things can change everything. And so, the simple bar of soap became more than just a cleaning tool. For those German women prisoners, it represented the first crack in a wall of propaganda. the first challenge to years of indoctrination. The American nurses who stepped naked into showers alongside their prisoners demonstrated something powerful, that true strength comes not from domination, but from shared humanity, as one. Former prisoner told her daughter years later, "They could have broken us with cruelty, and we would have understood that. We were prepared for it, but they broke us with kindness instead, and that was a wound that healed into something better than what was there before." Perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of this forgotten chapter of World War II, that sometimes the most effective weapon against hatred is not force, but compassion. Not because compassion is soft or weak, but because it challenges the very foundation of hatred itself. And while policies and treaties shaped the post-war world, it was these small, human moments, American nurses bathing with German prisoners, that truly began the work of reconstruction, one transformed mind at a time. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to like and subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history that reveal the human side of the greatest conflict of the 20th century.